Hello, I'm Lel Smits for the Finance News Network, and joining me today from the University of Western Sydney is Professor of Economics and Finance, Dr. Steve Keen. Steve, welcome back.
Delighted to be here.
Now, last time we spoke a year ago, you predicted a decade of volatility. How have your views changed since then?
I still think it's going to be a decade. What I'm actually aware of now, probably more than I was when I started doing this campaign about the level of private debt about 5 years ago, or 7 years ago. I'm more aware of the potential for what appear to be recoveries that will then die down, because what's actually driving this fluctuations in the level of debt as the private sector is deleveraging. So now I've got a way of measuring when it's likely to be, we're going to be seeing a bit of what looks like a recovery, and then when it's likely to peter out. So it's still the idea of a decade of volatility. In fact, it may be more volatile and worse than I was thinking, because what's happening in Europe now is an added level of chaos we didn't have to have for this crisis. It's very much man-made by the Maastricht Treaty. But given that combination, we'd like to see not just economic volatility, but I think political volatility as well. And in some ways, I'm just counting the days until we see a political coup in Europe.
But in the shorter term, Steve, what would it take to inspire some optimism?
It'd take a decision to actually reduce the debt directly. It'd take the authorities going from trying to boost the economy by pumping money into the reserves of accounts of the banks, and instead direct that government-created money towards the private sector and reduce the debt directly. I'm calling this a modern debt jubilee or quantitative easing for the public. If they did that, then I'd have confidence that we'd actually finally reduce the debt burden and enable growth to occur again, and to have growing debt where debt finances investment rather than speculation. But I can't see that coming for at least 5 years.
Well, it seems from Europe we seem to hear of a debt deal almost every month now. Who are investors supposed to believe?
Well, the debt deals are all about maintaining the debt rather than reducing it. They're all about deals about how we can reschedule everything so you can pay us later. But we've already got a level of debt we know they can't pay.
So you're not at all impressed?
You're just pushing it. It's the classic, they talk about kicking the can down the road. They're kicking the snowball down the road. It's getting bigger every time. So long as they continue saying you must actually honour your debts, and creditors can't take a loss over this, or losses to creditors have to be limited. They certainly talk about losses for the Greek creditors. They're simply delaying the inevitable.
So Steve, what do you make of the latest pledge from ECB President pledging to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro? What action do you anticipate?
Whatever it takes, in his lingo, does not include writing off debt. Once it includes writing off debt, or using the ECB's resources to pay down the level of private sector debt, or to use the ECB resources to fund deficits in countries which currently are running a massive deficit, then I'll believe him.
And in the absence of writing down debt, what do you think he means and what we will see?
What he means is continuing doing bailouts, where the bailouts really are about giving national governments European credit, which they then hand over to the banks that lent them too much money in the first place.
In the meantime, Australia has not escaped these European shockwaves. How do you believe our economy is holding up?
Well, it's certainly holding up better than the rest of the world, and that's got two factors behind it: the scale of the fiscal stimulus and the first-time vendors boost, which is now running out, but also selling to China. Of course, then we have to hope that China continues being the honeypot for Australia, and I think those days are running out.
And the mining boom, which has, of course, with some reports have projected it might end in as soon as 2 years. What's your opinion?
I think it will end in as soon as 2 years, because we had the highest terms of trade in our history at the end of a giant bubble, which China actually spiked by its enormous stimulus during the financial crisis itself. And that's brought on so many projects around the world, including, of course, Australia. Huge boost while we're building the projects. They may come online. We've now got more supply than there is demand in China, huge capacity there, and their economy itself is trending down rather than up. So the mining boom will end, and we'll have had too much investment in the process. We'll have to mop that up later.
Now, Steve, you're well known for your property price predictions, forecasting a few years ago Australian property prices will fall by 40% over the next 15 years. Do you still expect to say to Australia, I told you so?
Yes, I do. And of course, I had my words distorted by my property market competitors, claiming that I was calling the peak effectively in September of 2008, which I was not. But I'm quite happy to say the peak reached in June of 2010 was the peak. And I expect us ultimately look back and see house prices 40% lower than that in either real or nominal terms. It's hard to say which one will lead because we're in a deflationary world as well. But certainly 40% lower in real and nominal terms than June 2010 sometime in the next decade.
So since you made the call, how much have property prices fallen?
Over 10% in real terms, about 7% in nominal. We're likely to see that continue.
Okay, up to 40% then still by another 15 years?
These things fluctuate. It's driven as what really drives house prices up is accelerating mortgage debt. Now we're in massively decelerating mortgage debt. It can fluctuate, as you saw in America. Occasionally it turns around again, so prices don't have to trend down monotonically, but they'll bounce around on a declining trend. We have a bigger bubble than America. We're finally realising it. The property shortage nonsense has been shown to be so by the last census data. We're realising it was really the same as the rest of the world. We inflated our house prices using debt. They'll deflate as we reduce debt.
Finally, Steve, what are you working on at the moment?
I'm actually starting a new book, and the book's title is Why Won't This Depression End? And it's a riposte to Paul Krugman's End This Depression Now, because Krugman doesn't understand the importance of private debt, aggregate private debt, and the reductions in that. And I'm now going to explain it and say why the depression won't end until we abolish large slabs of the private debt.
Well, Steve Keen, thank you as always for your views.
You're welcome.